There is an intimate relationship between the ScreenTransferFunction and the histogram transformation tool. Now, these two tools are more similar than they are different from one another. I'm going to tell you all about the details, the inner workings of the histogram transformation utility in just a moment. But set all of that stuff aside. Don't worry about how it works for a moment. Let me just show you the most common way in which you'll interact with the tool, which does not require any of that kind of knowledge. All you need to know is the difference between the two tools is kind of how they work. The ScreenTransferFunction takes an input value from the data, from the image, values at those pixels, and then you're going to specify the function, the output of every one of those pixels by making adjustments here with these carets or parameters. So you're mapping an input value to a screen output value, but you're not touching the underlying data. It doesn't change. The histogram transformation utility actually modifies the data. So you have the input again from your image, but this time when you adjust the parameters, you're going to be specifying a transformation, a function, of an output value, but whatever it generates as output, when you actually execute it, modifies pixel values to be these new output values based on the adjustments that you made in the tool. So you're actually going to really change the data. And by changing the data, of course, you will change how it is displayed on the screen because you're changing the underlying values. But that's not a screen stretch, which is only a screen thing. It is a real change to the image. So the ScreenTransferFunction, the STF, is in some sense a virtual thing. And what if, here's the point, what if we, by manipulating things using this tool in an image, and I should bring up an image here. Here's an image of a globular cluster. What if, by making our adjustments, we display the image in such a way that we're happy with the way in which it looks? This is the what you see is what you get method of manipulating images, and it is a very common thing to do in terms of astrophotography. If it looks good on the screen, you say, okay, I want to make the image permanently look like this. I don't want to hit my little automatic screen stretch every time I'm going to work with this image now. I need to actually work with it in this form. So to make this virtual version of the image a real version by modifying the values, what you need to do is take the function that you're specifying by the parameters that you've created or adjusted here in the tool, and transfer those parameters, that's the values that you have here, you need to put them into this tool. And this tool accepts these parameters because they're also specified in a similar way in this tool. So the histogram transformation tool has these same parameters that for each of the channels and everything, which is basically the black point, the midtones, and the white point. Those are all specified here, so for each channel. So you can just transfer those to here. Now I could do the following. I could type in here for each channel. Let's say this is the luminance channel, right? So over here I would type in the numbers 002580. So that's what I'm going to, I can't do it right now because I'm in the other tool, but that's what I would type in here. And then I would type in for the midtones, I would type in this number. They really should have put the midtones maybe in the middle, but 0.001139 and then 1 for the highlights, right? So now I've transferred it. My work is pretty much done. But that would be a pain in the rear. So what you can do instead is you take the instance here of the ScreenTransferFunction and put it right here, right on the bar, to transfer these parameters into this tool. And look what happened. I didn't have to type them in. They got transferred right to these fields. So now we have the parameters that were here in here, and that's great. If I want to see the view in terms of the histogram that I'm looking at here, we can specify, the particular I don't have this set right now, but we can specify the particular view that we're looking at. There it is. So there's our kind of like our histogram with these settings. Then I would apply it to the image. Now, very important thing to understand. The screen went completely white. The reason the screen is white right now is because we have taken the image, we have adjusted the pixel values, but the screen transfer function here is still controlling, because I'm still tracking this view with this tool, is still controlling how this view will appear based on those original parameters. So it's like we've done the same parameters twice, because this tool just adjusted the pixel values, and this one is now doing the auto stretch on the new values, which is crazy. So if you turn off the auto stretch, now this is a permanently stretched image. These values are now they are now displayed in exactly the same way that we had them when we did it by the screen, but by putting the parameters in the histogram transformation and then applying it to the image itself, we can permanently adjust those values so it looks exactly like what we had a moment ago. Now the values, and I want to stress this, these values are permanently changed. So if we zoom into this image, everything here that is white on the screen is going to have a value of 1 or very nearly 1 here. And there's nothing I can do to somehow be able to better display what's going on here. We are effectively clipping that information because we've specified those values. They were some other value, but now there's something very nearly 1, if not 1 itself, but for all intents and purposes. So this would be not necessarily this kind of display choice for this object wouldn't necessarily be a good thing to do. It would be very difficult to continue to process this image in this form. But let's just look at this. I'm going to show it to you again. In order for me to show it to you again, I need to undo what I've done. To be clear, watch this. If I load the, see, there's the histogram transformation. If we look at the History Explorer here, you can see that we've applied this, this tool with those settings onto this image, and that is an adjustment, big time. So I'm going to undo the adjustment. Now the screen transfer function is controlling, of course, the appearance of this, and we have it off at the moment, so it looks dark again. If I turn the automatic on, we have back our view of the image. Now, if I roll my cursor over the regions that were white, you'll notice they are no longer all very nearly 1 values, although when I run over some stars, they appear that way. Because we have not, this is only a screen stretch, we have not adjusted any of these values yet. However, we can transfer, let me zoom back out, these parameters right here, transfer them to this tool, and then the second step, you can, if you would like, so maybe it will be less confusing, I can turn off the automatic screen stretch. Now I have parameters here, not yet applied, and I have my, what is still a linear image, it has yet to be adjusted. Let's make the adjustment now. And it looks like I did an auto stretch, but I've actually adjusted the underlying data in such a way that it looks like this on the screen. So this is a way, using the histogram transformation tool, it is a way to take a what you see version of the image into what you get by taking those parameters and applying it to the image. This is a way to permanently stretch your images. Let's look in detail at the histogram utility and how it works. I have an image that, again, is the image of M13, and as it is being displayed right now, you can only see the very brightest stars. The image has not been stretched or manipulated either for the screen or in any permanent manner. This is just raw data, what it looks like when you open up the image. You can see some of the brightest stars, but you certainly don't see the 100,000 others that are also in the data. Now, if I do the automatic STF ScreenTransferFunction calculation here and display the image, I'm doing Control A on the keyboard, you will see all of those stars in the data. So they're all in there. Turning this off, though, you're going to get this straight relationship unstretched image. And we'll manipulate this in such a way that will permanently stretch the data so that when we open up the image, it doesn't look like this, but it actually does look like kind of the screen stretched version, but not necessarily to this degree. And that's the choices that we'll make when we make some adjustments over here in the tool. So to explain how the histogram transformation utility works, it's best to understand how this kind of graphic visualization of things, we have these two rectangular areas, what that's showing us is useful. So I need to describe a little bit about these graphs. Now these are histograms, and just as I described in an earlier section about a histogram, you'll see here, they have the same kind of components that we saw earlier. There's a black point, which is synonymously related to the shadows. There's a white point, the caret over here, we can move around if we want. And that is the highlights. And then finally we have the midpoint value, which is related to the midtones. Now, this graph is a little different than the one I showed earlier, though. Typically in a histogram, along the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, you're going to have the brightness levels, which is what we show here. And along the vertical axis, we're going to have the frequency. Again, we show that here as well. The frequency of particular brightness levels, the number of them. However, this graph is a normalized representation because the data is normalized. So we're not looking at the values as recorded by the camera, but we're looking at that normalized value of between 0 and 1. So the numbers along the horizontal axis range from 0 to 1. So what are the numbers along the vertical axis? Well, they chose to also normalize that. So the number of values at a particular brightness is going to basically be a percentage. In other words, it's going to be a value between 0 and 1. So you're basically plotting this percentage of pixels are at this brightness level, which is a fine way to do it, but you need to appreciate that when we're zooming in and out of the graphs, which we'll do in just a moment, that we're not actually looking at the values as recorded by the camera or an enumerated number of values. It's not like we're going to see 1,000,000 values or 10 values at a particular brightness, but we're seeing a percentage of values at a particular brightness. And that does certainly have an effect on how we see this histogram. Now, the bottom graph is the input. So in a moment, and why don't I go ahead and do this, we'll link this to a view, and the view we want is M13, and of course we'll track it. And there we are. You can't see the histogram, right? And that's for a very important reason. It's there. We are tracking this properly, but we'll need to zoom in to see the histogram. However, it is now graphing the data of this image in this lower area. Nothing is really showing up in the upper area. It'll show the exact same graph in the upper area because all we're doing is we're saying, well, our input value and our output value, because we haven't made a change, is the same. For every value, it's the same value, whatever it is. So these will match one another. Now, once we start manipulating these carets, moving things around, then the input and the output values, of course, will differ. So this upper window is going to show us how the histogram, that is how the brightnesses and frequency of brightnesses will change according to the manipulations that we're making. In fact, now I can tell you what this diagonal line is. Whenever we make a change, the line here is the function, the mathematical function that describes the input versus output relationship. So if we're inputting, if we have some value here and we're outputting the same value, then the input and output are equal. If I were to graph that, if I had some value 100 and then I output 100 and then I also have a value of 305 and I output 305, what I'm going to do is have if I graph that, I'll have a diagonal line just as displayed here with a slope that's equal to a 45-degree angle. It's a one-to-one relationship. But we don't, of course, need a one-to-one relationship. We'll create what is a non-linear representation of the data where the input and output values, the function is not aligned, non-linear. That's where it comes from. So we're going to get into the discussion of what non-linear data means, but let's not make it non-linear yet. We need to see the histogram first so that you can kind of get a sense of what the data looks like. That requires understanding the tools of being able to zoom in and move around in these regions. So we have a zoom factor for both the lower and the upper, that is the input and the output graphs. Now why would they need to be different? The answer is because when we make a manipulation here, that can change the upper graph enough that things are shifted. Basically, if we were to use the same parameters to view it here, it wouldn't be in this window. It might be shifted off of the frame or the field. So not necessarily are they going to be in the same positions in the same way and so on. So you actually need two controls, one for the input and one for the output histogram. And that's why you have these two zoom factors here. The readout mode will actually show you, based on your image, where a particular brightness value is. So notice if I'm going to actually press on the screen here, and I'm putting my let's see if I can find a star. When I find a star, this star has a K value, a brightness value of 0.41. Well, 0.41 is a little bit less than 0.5, which would be a mid-tone or a midpoint value, right? So the purple line and the green line represent that number. That's 0.41. Now if I put it near the sky or something dimmer, then notice how it moves to the left, because now I have a smaller value, 0.06. And on truly a sky value, I mean, it's all squished over on the left side. It seems like it's not there, but if you look very closely, that little purple line and green line, they are there. They're just right against that left edge. Now let's zoom in. We know as an astronomical image that in terms of percentage of values, the preponderance of values of this image are very, very small numbers because it's sky values. It's not star values. So that means we want to zoom into a region that's tucked away, even in the, I'm not going to change anything, so we're just going to look in the input here, and we're going to zoom in here. Now you can zoom in both axes. I'm not so concerned about zooming into the vertical axis. We really need to zoom in the horizontal sense so that we can see stuff here. Now, you'll always know when you're zoomed in if you don't, pay attention to the numbers here, because the carets are going to disappear. Only when you're at 1-to-1 do you get to see all three carets, all three black point, midpoint, and white point. Another thing to know is that if you ever get to the point where you get lost, you can always zoom back out to 1-to-1 just by pressing this button and start over or something like that. But let's zoom in. So if I roll my cursor here, it says horizontal zoom. That's the one we want. And if I just press the button and hold down on it, I am zooming in, and now you can start to see values. There's different ways of graphing it. I am currently graphing it with bars because I think it makes it easier to see, but you can do lines and area, and actually area is pretty good too. Dots, not so good. Maybe area is kind of fun, but we'll keep it bars or lines. We can zoom in some more. Now it gets a little boring here, so you can start to type in big numbers. Watch what happens if I do 500. It's gone. Where'd it go? Well, this is the black point. You'll notice it's cut off on the left side and it's black. So that means that our histogram is probably somewhere way off the screen over here. We can pan with this button. This will allow us to move. And there it is. See, it was off the screen, and now here's the histogram again. Now recognize that it looks like I'm zoomed in a little bit here because I'm clipped off here. But recognize that most values are still not going to show up here. And I really want you to appreciate the logic behind what I mean. Let me roll my cursor on this readout, and let me get to some values here. See, none of these values are over where the histogram is. I have to zoom back out again. But these values are very, very small. If I put the histogram here, I roll this cursor across here, you can see where some of these values actually are. They're down near the 0.0003. I mean, this is basically the sky. And all the other values, like when I roll the cursor, oh, there it is, are much, much greater than this histogram. See, the purple is way over on the right, on the bottom graph, but look, it's still way over on the left in the top graph. We're looking in the same place, because we're not zoomed in on the top graph, but we are on the bottom graph. Okay, so the main point that I want to get across here is that if I scroll way over here, now this is our input-output, that's our function. This line here, that's our functional line. We don't need to worry about that at the moment. If that bothers you, you can turn it off with this button here. This is the one that turns off the transfer function curve, and you can turn that on and off, but it's not bothering me. All I want you to see is that if you look very, very at the very bottom, very, very tiny little dots there, well, there are lots of values that are at these brightness levels, but there's so few of them that no matter how much I zoom in, I'm never going to see them very well, because the percentage of them is so small. And just let me give you a sense of what I mean by that. Let's say that the average star here is, you know, I don't know, 50% bright or some number, right? And there's 100,000 of them. But the picture itself has 16 million pixels, and I have 100,000 stars. So what percentage of this picture, in terms of a frequency, a histogram, are we talking about? If there's 100,000 stars and we have 16 million pixels, should we be able to see a spike for those stars, or spikes for those stars, in our histogram here in this input as we have it displayed? Well, let's look at what that percentage would be. So we take 100,000, there we are, but we divide by, this chip has, it's 4,000 by 4,000 pixels, it so happens. So this would be a 16 million, 16, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That means that only, in terms of total number of pixels, only it's not much more than 0.5%. 0.5% displayed here in this graph. Remember, this goes from 0 to 1. 0.5% is right down here near the bottom. So we're not expecting in our histogram graph to see very much of the information here, because it's just too small. You just can't see it. And by the way, as I scroll around here in the zoomed in, sometimes it's hard to find your histogram because it's still squished way over to the left. There it is. But here it is, okay? So most values that you can see graphically are just sky values. It's just the very, very dimmest things. And this is where the sky kind of starts, is on this edge here. Now, I'd like to demonstrate something for you, just to be certain that things are making sense. I'm going to make a copy of this image. I have a copy, and we'll look at our screen transfer function. I'm going to go ahead and just transfer, well, first I've got to do my automatic thing. I'm going to transfer those values to here, and then we will permanently do it to this image. We will turn off the screen transfer function. I will close this. This is a permanently stretched image. Permanent. Now, let me reset. I'm going to reset this tool. So there is now the tool itself, the histogram transformation, is not doing anything. But suddenly we can see lots of information in our histogram. Unlike this one where we don't, here we do. Why? Well, because we've permanently stretched this image. This is a non-linear image, which again I'll explain in a moment, because it's been permanently adjusted. But now many, many values of the image are truly of the, bright enough, they're at 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, they're going to be represented graphically in our histogram window here. It's easy to see. The point is that if you open an image and you don't see very much in terms of a histogram, it's likely it hasn't been touched. If you open an image and suddenly you see all this information that looks like this, then it probably means it's a nonlinear image, because you have lots of brightnesses that would indicate that it's already been adjusted in some way. So it's just a quick tip to appreciate what you're looking at when you look at some of these images. Before I leave this screen, because it's still here, let me point out something else. Notice how when I roll my cursor across the window, you'll see the X position. That's, of course, the horizontal brightness level. You'll see a Y value, and that's, again, a frequency value. But notice in parentheses there's something else. It says a number, like, well, right now it's saying 15,000 to 15,595 to 15,759. What is that all about? That deals with the binning. So you have a normalized representation here between 0 and 1, but every step you can divide, in order to graph this information, you can divide the data, the brightnesses, into the number of sub-little divisions that account for, like a 16-bit data, you would expect to have the 65,000 little divisions. So if you were to divide this up into that number of divisions and you bin them, then this gives you, let's see, this gives you the bin width. So at the X value of basically 0.2, the number of data values that we're talking about is a range of, what is that? It's like 200, it's a little less than 250 or so, a range of a brightness of 150. So if it finds a value in our data between that range, it will go into that little line, adding up to whatever the number is on the Y value. So it's 7% or something like that. If I change it, watch what happens. I can make this, I can divide it up more coarsely, like an 8-bit representation. These are like grayscales basically now. And if I roll the cursor back along the histogram, notice that the range now is just the, we're now dividing it into the bins of brightness level, 0 to 255. So this is 56, this is 62. These are the grayscale representations basically on the screen. This is going to be a screen representation of what you're seeing, or of the input data. And then you don't need to do this kind of binary division. You could also divide in these levels of 100, 1,000, or 10,000 binning groups. So 10,000 is still coarser than the 16-bit here, which is 64K, right? But it gives you the option to change the binning, and that will kind of fill in or make more coarse the bins that you see here represented in the screen. See how it made the little line? If I zoom in more, it'll make it easier to see there are finer divisions in those lines. Now we're currently looking at this image. So let's make sure everything is set. We are tracking this image. We haven't made an adjustment, but we really want to make an adjustment. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to slide the midtone. I could do the white. I'll do both. We're going to adjust the white point and the midtone, which is going to make it something like a curve. Now you know that the histogram in the input, if we zoom in, it's way over here on the left side. It's just sitting there. But now notice how we can see something showing up in the output graph. The whole histogram has shifted to the right because we've brightened things up. And it may have made another change there as well. I mean, it's hard to tell. It just looks like a little spiky thing. But now the output differs from the input, and that's really the distinction we want to make. Now, it didn't change anything in the image at all, and it won't. The way this tool is not a screen visualization type tool. though we can access a screen-like visualization by looking at the real-time preview of what's going on. So click this button, and now we have, let's undo what I've done so we can just reset. Each of these things can be reset with the little X's here. So now we're back to where we began with. And if I change the white point, you'll see that, it gets brighter. And of course, if I change that mid-tone, also the mid-tone values get brighter, and so on. And if we choose just the right settings, we will eventually get back to even what the automatic settings were kind of giving us. So let's say that we do something like this. Now we've brightened it up, right? But now we want the sky to look a little bit darker. That means we need to have access to our black point. Well, at the moment, our black point is so difficult to get a hold of here, we need to zoom in. So we would zoom in. Now we've got our midpoint here. We can continue to brighten if we want, but we can raise the black point, making the sky look dark like this. And you can see what it's doing up here. This is now the output of this graph. It's gotten wider, it's shifted its position, all that kind of stuff is going on. So the real-time display, the nice thing about it is, of course, you get real-time feedback. It's not perfect, it won't exactly match the result, but it gives you a very good idea of what's going on. Unfortunately, one of the drawbacks is that you can't really make a very big version of it. There's no way to zoom in to the real-time preview, so you really get kind of this zoomed out version of your image that you're looking at. But for these purposes, for the histogram transformation tool, it actually works well. Other things where you need to see the details of stuff, it may not be quite as useful. But here, it's just fine, actually. So if we're happy with that, we can close this. And then these would be the values. Whatever our shadows and our highlights and our midpoint, these would be the values that we apply, and we will get that representation that we just saw, or something very close, in the real-time preview. Now, bear in mind something, and this is kind of the same thing that we saw with the screen transfer function. This tool now is set to whatever the last settings that we had. It's almost as if we're trying to apply it twice, because these carets at this position is going to result in this output for this now new version of the image. Basically what I'm suggesting is, set everything back, zero out everything here, because this is a new version of this image. And now we're seeing the image both in an input and output from a beginning point. And then if we want to adjust this image more, because we already did it once, we can. All right, so now we can look at some of the sliders and things that the tool gives us based on what we just did. You know that these carets, when we move them around to do something to the image, they are manipulating these numbers here in these fields. So you can type in a number here if you want, or you can slide things around if you want. That's the same operation. When you move the white point and black point in particular, it tells you the clipping amount in terms of pixels, a percentage of pixels. It actually gives you the number of pixels and a percentage. So that's interesting to know as well, if you want to know how much of the image things are being clipped if you don't see everything. This will give you a sense. So there's now 1% of the pixels when I make this adjustment. This represents 1% clipping, further clipping, I guess, than what is already in the image. And likewise, with the black point, by adjusting it, you'll get a percentage, a number of pixels and a percentage that are being clipped. Now, there are also some little tools here to auto-clip at a particular percentage. So let's say you just want to clip 1%, wherever that ends up being. So you can press the button here, and you'll notice that it comes, I guess 1% comes right over to approximately where the sky value is. It comes right up to the edge. Now you can either physically move it over there, or you can do the 1% level. Auto 0 puts it right back to 0, which I guess is the same as the reset shadows clipping. And there's a 1% here as well. So if we look at the auto clip setup, we can change what the default percentage is. So if you always want to press that button and use some default percentage, here is where you get to make that adjustment. So that's easy enough. Now there's something a little more sophisticated which I'd like to demonstrate. So I'm going to yet again adjust this image in some crazy way. I'm going to make it pretty bright here. Now I'm not looking at the real time. I know that by adjusting the midpoint here I'm going to brighten up this image. There it is. And let's reset everything. So we have a nice bright image here. These little tools are going to let you look at the values of these points that we're interested in, either the black point or the midpoint or the white point. And then if we wanted to assign that point, wherever we click, to be the setting for the value. So in other words, if we wanted the sky to be dark, we could click here on our little black point readout mode. Now right now the shadows is set to 0, right? But we click and we move around, we can determine what that black point value might be because we're on the sky here. So here's the sky. It's like 0.3 here. And what is it down here? It's like, it's again 0.32 down here as well. A moment ago, you may have detected a little uncertainty in my voice. I was stalling for a little bit of time because the tool wasn't doing what I expected it to do. Now, normally, when this happens to me, it's generally something that I've done wrong, so I stop, figure out what I did wrong, and re-record so you don't see every single mistake that I make. I make quite a few of them. This time, though, I'm not going to do that. I didn't make a mistake. I found a bug in the program. So you'll see this little hiccup between the last section and this one because I'm re-recording from this point, and I'll show you what the tool is doing and then, of course, explain what it should do. When you click on these little readout buttons, as I mentioned a moment ago, what should happen is that I'm going to select the black point, and that means when I click on the image, the value that I click on in the image will be transferred to the shadows field. That's the way it should work. Just like in the ScreenTransferFunction, the STF tool, it should happen in the same way here, but it doesn't. I click on the screen. What should get transferred into that field is a 0.1387 blah blah blah, but that doesn't go there. A 0 remains. If I click somewhere else, again, no change. Now, it's not that it's not changing. It is actually putting a 0 in there to demonstrate. Watch this. If I click on the white point. Now, let's click on what we might think of a white point. I'm just going to use a star, a value that's not, 0. Notice how the highlights is currently 1 as it is for the upper end. Now, click on the star. What I should get here, if I move it around, is a value such as, I'm not getting on the star. There, now I'm on the star. So I've got 0.99. That's what should be transferred into the highlights field. But notice what is put there instead. It's a 0. Not only that, but the white point caret is now squished all the way over here to the left. And of course the histogram, the output histogram is gone and all of that kind of stuff. So this is not the correct behavior, and I suspect that by the time you see this recording, it'll be fixed. But here then is a recording of what it was doing at the time I was making this tutorial. So that's how it should work. It'll probably work for you just fine, but wow, it sure is kind of frustrating sometimes when you come across these things, because it's not that there is an extra level of complexity. It's not that the tool is doing something, so advanced that we can't figure out what it is. Instead, it literally is just not quite doing the right thing. It's a good lesson to consider. Sometimes things don't make sense, not just because we just don't have enough information or experience, but literally just because it's not working. That tends not to happen often, but it is a possibility, and sometimes it does happen. Let's continue and look at a color image and just make sure that everything we see here really does work in the same way when we examine a color image instead of a grayscale image. When looking, I'm going to reset the tool here. When looking at a color image, of course, we're going to see the individual color channels and their representative histograms displayed all together. Of course, we can look at the individual channels if we wish and make adjustments accordingly. So when you look at the individual channels, of course, it kind of gets rescaled so that the display is commensurate with the data that we're looking at, as opposed to this altogether view. And the adjustments that we might choose to make here with these sliders, we can either do it on one of the channels in and of itself, or we could do it to the full range, the full set of all three channels simultaneously. You'll see all three channels being affected. Of course, if we did just one channel at a time and it's a color image, it would certainly affect the color balance of the image when you make those kinds of adjustments. The only other thing in this tool which I have yet to explain is the expansion of the low and high ranges, the dynamic range expansion. I'm going to save that until after I've had a chance to explain about the nonlinearity of images. So that will be the next topic that follows this section of the histogram transformation tool in general.